Hello everyone, my name is Martin, your host and game master for the YouTube channel Nerds and Stuff. Now today we're going to be covering 8 simple tips for starting your new role-playing campaign. Let's get started. Now here at Nerds and Stuff, I'm the resident GM. We're currently running a Star Wars Edge of the Empire campaign. We've been doing this for the last 8 months. Ran a lot of one-shots for the channel as well. And I'll be referencing some of that material as we go so you can see real-life examples of what I'm talking about. Now I haven't been just playing for the last 8 months, I've been GMing for the last 10 years. So whenever my friends and I sit down to play, I generally default to the GM, and that's a job that I actually quite love nowadays. So I kind of racked my brain lately and came up with these kind of 8 tips and tricks that I usually run through when I'm starting any one of my various campaigns. Now these are system generic, so you can use any of these tips and tricks for any role-playing system. Now, the first thing that I wanted to cover is asking yourself as a game master, how often am I going to play? And when I do sit down and play with my friends, how long is each session going to be? Now, generally, these will define a lot of parameters for your role-playing game. For instance, if you're meeting every single week, you have a lot more time to delve into characters, to delve into story, to press on the world. But if you're only playing once a month or twice a month, you might not have that kind of time to where you can really slow down, take time to smell the roses. Now, if you're playing once a week, but you only play 2 hours a week, then that kind of hits the same situation. A lot of times, if your campaigns are anything like mine, when my players come over to my house before we sit down for the night, we usually hang out, catch up, see how each other's going, be socialites for a few minutes before we sit down and start rolling dice. And if your players are anything like that, that 2 hours is going to be over in a matter of moments. But if you sit down once a week and you play for 6 hours a session, then you'll have quite the amazing amount of time to really explore your worlds and explore your characters and really press on the fiction and see what presses back. So as a GM, one of your first questions is how often are we going to play and how much time are we going to play for every single session. Once you have those two locked down, I think your options will start to kind of line themselves out for what type of stories you can tell in that time. Additionally, if you have someone you know is going to be leaving for the summer and it's already February, then you kind of have to plan around those parameters, and that might shape your campaign's duration and ultimately narrative. Number 2, you need to sit down with your players and talk about the kind of stories that you guys want to tell. Now, at the start of every campaign, finding people to sit down and play with you can be a challenge, but we're just going to assume that you have your party already taken care of, or at least most of your party. One pro tip that I always use is dupe your friends into playing role-playing games with them. A lot of times role-playing games have a negative connotation, but when you actually talk to them about it, tell them what's going on, you'll be surprised at how many of your non-nerdy friends can become some of your best and most beloved role players. That's probably a video for a separate time, however. Today we're just going to talk about what kind of stories you and your party wants to tell. And this isn't necessarily limited to the themes and tones. This can be, do you mostly like dungeon crawling, or do you want to do a political intrigue or a thriller, or do you want to mostly focus on character? Is the story about a location, or is it about characters, or is it about a single character? These are the kind of questions you want to ask yourself. Now, sometimes when you set out for a campaign, you might think, I know exactly what I'm looking for. This is the story of a kingdom. Or you might sit down and say, I don't really know what I want to play. I think I want to do a political thriller, but I don't really even know where to start with that. These are questions that, as a GM, you're starting to ask yourself, and whatever seems interesting might press back and give you a lot more inspiration. If you sit down and your party's really gung-ho for dungeon crawling and you're not really that kind of GM, then that might create a lot of problems later on down the road and in the campaign, to where every single week you're feeling uninspired to sit down with your friends and play. And that's not going to create a situation where you're going to want to keep that campaign going. So talk to your players. One big thing that you'll find throughout this whole video is that communication is key. Talking with your players, figuring out what you guys are interested in, and what maybe you have done before that you're comfortable with and want to look at from a new angle, or what you're kind of unfamiliar with and curiosity draws you to. So those are the kind of themes and tones that you might want to talk about. Is what style of play do you want to have? Do you want to crawl through the dungeon, or do you never want to enter a dungeon because you're so swallowed whole by the politics of the city? Two completely different campaigns, both could be a great game night. Number 3. Now there is a somewhat great debate on what type of campaign to run as far as linear or railroading versus sandbox. That's kind of a difficult topic to approach with some players, because the second a player hears, oh, this is going to be a very linear story, they might immediately feel like they have no free will as far as their character progression and stuff like that. But from my experience personally, through my years and years of campaign GMing, is that linear almost always creates a better story for me and my players. When I sit down and create a linear style campaign, I don't plan every detail, and I'll cover this here in a little bit later in the video. What I do is I like to create a very strong beginning and a great middle point or kind of end point or 3/4 point to where I kind of see the campaign heading towards. Now you don't get that same kind of sensation in a sandbox campaign. In a sandbox, say you want to build a city from scratch and you want the entire campaign to be housed in that city. I'm actually starting to run a campaign like that in an Urban Shadows role-playing system. And so when we're looking at this city as our campaign, in Urban Shadows, the campaign is not about your players, it's about the city itself. So we all come to the table knowing that the city is the story and that our characters are major players in that story. So when we sit down and create the city, we create a lot of fun elements for the players to really press on and explore and get lost in. But we don't know where we're going to be by the end of the night. That's sometimes the detriment of a sandbox campaign, is you can talk about the kind of campaign you want to run, like political intrigue, right? You can use that as your baseline, and you can play your sandbox towards political intrigue. But as far as great moments, epic moments, it's really hard to kind of plan for. I'm going to use Star Wars as an example, right? If Star Wars was a sandbox, who knows if Luke would end up in that X-Wing running, hauling down the trench, getting ready to blow up the Death Star 1. But he's there, and George Lucas planned for this kind of Death Star to be over Yavin to be in peril, and Luke, being one of our heroes, stepped into the role. Now, when you're looking at linear storytelling, it's not just railroading, and that's often a negative connotation that players have with this type of storytelling. It doesn't necessarily mean that you as a GM sit down and plan every single moment of the campaign, but it does sometimes mean that you sit down and you plan maybe a good ending point for the night, right? Once, I'm going to take Star Wars for an example. In my campaign, Legacy of Ash, the very first 4 hours, or very first night at the table, was a tutorial-esque mission. And in that tutorial, they sat down, and I knew that they were going to start on Alderaan and end up as prisoners on the Death Star, and they were going to escape. And I gave them plenty of opportunities for them to figure out what that escape looks like, what the ship was, how they went about it. And everything in between, we just kind of figured out as we went. Now, I am a bit of an over-planner when it comes to the start of a campaign, so I had several pages kind of written up to help me reinforce the setting. And we'll talk about making the setting real here in a few minutes, but for me, I wanted to create a strong opening point and a great ending point, which was a jump to light speed, having escaped the Death Star. And in the 4 hours, we managed to get through that. And along the way, the players had surprises for me as a GM. So in a lot of sense, when you're building a linear story, you would very much love for your players to start on Alderaan and end by jumping into hyperspace on off the Death Star. Players can often derail that kind of stuff. Now, there is always flexibility, because in the next several 24 hours of the campaign, I kept having it in my head that we would be off Corellia within a matter of hours. And so I kind of planned for about 6 to 8 hours of Corellia at most using the Corellian sourcebook. But my players kept surprising me and kept pressing on the setting, kept exploring Corellia and exploring their characters in Corellia or their characters with each other. And so me as a linear storyteller in this Legacy of Ash campaign allowed them to press on that, take their time. We have the benefit of playing once a week for several hours when we do sit down. So both me and my players decided that that was something we were interested in. Now you as a GM, you might have a pretty strict timetable. And it's important to communicate with your players early and often that ideally this is how it's going to go. We get to this city by the start of the session. We leave the city at the end of the session. And your players, if they understand that, they will help you work towards that. Because ultimately, role-playing games, and especially role-playing games at my table, are cooperative storytelling moments, right? They're opportunities to get together with your friends and tell amazing stories. And so now I've talked a little bit about both linear and sandboxing. Now this will be probably a video unto itself later on, and the kind of pros and cons and pitfalls of each one of these. But just know that linear doesn't mean railroading, and sandbox doesn't mean, oh my god, my players are trying to ruin my game, because those are the two basic kind of worries that GMs have with both of these, and there are ways to work around it. But ultimately, talking to your players, figuring it out with them, is going to be the best piece of advice I can give you as far as those two. If you want to tell a better story, linear is almost always going to get you there. If you want to have greater moments of character growth, sandbox is going to be the way to go. Now, sandboxing also requires a lot more heavy lifting before the campaign starts to build that city. But keep in mind that you don't have to build the city before you start. Let your players help you build it with them. For number 4, we're going to talk about mechanical density. Now, that sounds kind of weird, right? Role-playing games can be anywhere from you and your friends just sitting around telling a story together around a campfire. That's maybe not a true to fashion role-playing game, but that doesn't make it any less of a storytelling kind of cooperative narrative where you and your friends play roles in that game. It could be as dense as almost miniature wargaming in a sense too, and there's a lot of role-playing games that have mechanics for every single thing you do, and then there's a plethora, the entire breadth of role-playing systems in between that. Now there are some very famous ones, some ones that are definitely top of the charts that fall in between, like Dungeons and Dragons, Call of Cthulhu, World of Darkness, right, the Vampire Masquerade games. Then there's a lot more games that are published by indie developers, like this new campaign we're starting called Urban Shadows. Smaller game came out recently, but that doesn't make it any less worthwhile for trying. Now, ultimately, mechanical density can be a deal breaker for you and your players. I've sat down with players who needed rules for every single thing they did, because coming into a role-playing game can be scary sometimes for a new player, and knowing that there's a rule for everything that they can read and understand and comprehend can allow them to feel more empowered in their character. Now, there's other players that prefer the complete opposite. They have their imagination as their mechanic, as their engine, right? And they say, I want to do this. And we, as GMs and other players at the table, figure out what mechanic that comes down to. Look at all these Powered by the Apocalypse games. These are very rules light. They have very basic moves. They have very basic characteristics. When you sit down and play, you say what you want to do, and then you roll after the fiction demands that a roll is made where the outcome is unknown. We play a lot of Dread here on the channel. Now, Dread, the very basic mechanic is if your character has to do something that they're not talented at or that they're doing under duress, they pull from the Jenga tower. And if they knock over the tower, then their character is removed from the game, usually by death. It's a very straightforward mechanic that a lot of people understand the base core of because they played Jenga before. Now, maybe people haven't played all these mechanically dense systems, so you have to figure out what your players are interested in and what you're interested in running. One of the players here on the channel is very interested in running a setting type game, but because the mechanics are so dense, it pulls them away from the idea of running that system. So it's important for you as a GM and you as your players to sit down and figure out what kind of mechanics do you want to use. And the most important rule I can even tell you about mechanics is don't let them ruin your game. Whether it be rules light or rules heavy, if you have to talk about mechanics or if you have to debate over a mechanic for more than 20 or 30 seconds, settle on a decision. Come back to it in between sessions, in between your later in the night when you're on break. Come back to that rule and define what it is. But as a game master, it's your job to make a quick judgment call on what that is, because it's your job to keep the story moving. It's your job to keep your players engaged. So if you and another player are debating over rules for the next 5, 10, whatever minutes, that's however many other players that aren't part of the narrative, that might not know the rules as much as you and your rules lawyer. If you're debating the rules that much, then you're not playing that much. So pick a system that feels right for the amount of detail that you want to memorize rules or be comfortable with rules, and that's really going to help you in the long run. Number 5, I was recently asked this on the channel. How far out should a GM plan? I kind of touched on this earlier in this video. For me, I like to plan a powerful beginning, right? And we'll cover this here in a moment. But then I like to figure out kind of what is the end game? What are we steering towards? I recently ran a Dungeons and Dragons campaign where I knew that the very first moment we would create a powerful enemy out of the fiction. A cult that wants to stop at nothing to achieve their dastardly deed. And the end result was the return of Tiamat, the Dragon Queen. This campaign was very much inspired by the Kobold Press Horde of the Dragon Queen and Tyranny of Dragons kind of storyline. Now this campaign was very much heavily inspired by the Tyranny of Dragons storyline by Kobold Press, but I wanted to make it mine. I wanted to make it my table. So we took a very strong intro and we kind of directed it towards a similar ending of this cult resurrecting this dragon goddess to wreak havoc on the world until the end of time or until another set of heroes came. And so we created this kind of end game. And early on, I decided something pretty crazy. I was going to give my players a powerful artifact. And I had no idea how the artifact would play throughout the rest of the duration of the campaign, but it ended up creating some amazing storytelling opportunities and moments. Now going back to the original talking point, how far do you plan out? Plan an amazing opening, as strong of an opening as you can think of, and figure out the rest as you play. Create maybe like an end moment or a 2/3 moment or a halfway point that you want to be at. An end game, so to speak, and kind of work towards it. But be flexible. Be flexible. If you have every moment of your campaign planned out, write a book. Write a book. Don't bring it to the role-playing table, because your players are going to surprise you. When they do, take what they do and run with it. When your characters show you something, show them that you're paying attention. Showing them that their decisions matter, even in a linear story, can help them feel like this world is real and feel like you're a fan of their choices and their characters and them as players. And that's a really powerful moment, is when a player surprises you and you surprise them right back, showing them that their decisions matter, even in a story where you might know that you're leaving this city at the end of the day. Next, number 6. Number 6, one of the big decisions you might make as a GM, or small decisions you might make as a GM for the very first session, is does my party know each other? Or are they all kind of individuals thrown together by whatever twist of fate has started this story? Now, each decision comes with its own pitfalls and benefits. If your players have been playing together for some time, often it might be a better way to start the campaign by saying, you guys are all adventurers, you've known each other for a couple weeks now, a couple months, couple years, and just get to the action, right? A lot of times players will start in a tavern, right? They'll start in a tavern, they'll get their first adventure hook, and off they go into the wilderness to slay the foul creatures. But a lot of other times, like talking about my recent campaign, or my current campaign, Star Wars Legacy of Ash, 2 of the players had never played role-playing games before. And they're not particularly big on Star Wars at that time, and they didn't know the setting. They didn't know my other players. They didn't know me as a GM. So I figured, what better way to start this campaign than to identify them as individuals and see where they grow as a party. Now, this can be very difficult to do, and to do right, because you're having 4 people who just finished character creation feeling very boldly about their characters, and they all want to split the spotlight. They all want to be the star early on. They all want to do something amazing. And it's important for you as a GM to support those moments, to build moments for them to be amazing. But where do you start to make, one of your players become friends with another player, even though their personalities clash? How do you facilitate that kind of play? Especially your first session, when you're trying to kick off the campaign with a dynamic moment that will build until the very finale of the campaign a year from now. But your players don't know each other, they don't trust each other, so why would they travel together? One of the answers to this is put them in a situation where their best choice is strength in numbers with strangers, right? Talking about this Legacy of Ash campaign, they don't know each other starting off. In fact, one of them is an Imperial. One of them is a hired gun sort of mercenary type, and another person is already captured by the Imperials for being a sort of spy. And yet, by the end of the adventure, they're all jumping into hyperspace together on the same ship, because it's get off the rock, get off the murder ball, or rot, and maybe eventually blow up on, in the orbit of Yavin. So they have best interest in common. Use your first, if you do decide to allow your players to be individuals first, create moments where they have to be together by necessity, right? Someone's trying to kill everyone associated with this merchant, and they've all met this merchant, they've all decided to work for this merchant. Now someone assassinated the merchant and is trying to kill any of their associates. Now the 3 or 4 of your players are caught in this web together. Let them build as a party as they go. Now, if you start them out as a party, that's fairly straightforward, but still give them that opening scene, that great moment, right? Allow them to be their individuals within this seamless machine as they continue on. If they're all, rebels in the rebellion, then allow your saboteur to have an amazing moment. Allow your spy to have an amazing moment. Allow your diplomat to diplomatize, right? Allow these people to take the spotlight and run with it for a little bit so they feel like they're individuals in a group from the very first moment. Number 7, introducing your setting to your players. Now, there's a lot of different systems out there, and a lot of different systems have their own settings, right? Dungeons and Dragons is a very fantasy generic setting. Especially, older versions have a lot more flexibility, and they have a lot more supplements. Right now, 5th edition is heavily rooted in the Forgotten Realms, and that is a great thing, and it's also sort of a scary thing as a GM coming into a new system. What if I don't know the Forgotten Realms? What if I don't feel comfortable playing in the Forgotten Realms because one of my players is an avid reader of the books? What if I know nothing about Star Wars? You probably don't want to run a Star Wars campaign, but that doesn't mean you should rule out sci-fi altogether, right? Knowing your setting always helps you out as a GM. But if you're ambitious and crazy like I often am, you can build your own setting. And that can be as simple as, starting from scratch. Or it could be taking something and, shamelessly ripping it off until it's this Frankenstein monster of several different settings altogether. Or if you're going to play dead and hardline Star Wars and then you're asking your own questions like, do I use the expanded universe, right? If you play Lord of the Rings, do my players ever run into any of the major characters, right? Or do they just go to these locations and make reference points to Frodo having been here recently, or some of the big wigs like, oh, Gandalf was here, or Gandalf is coming. Right? These are the things you have to understand as a GM. Your players will look for. If you're playing in a setting that's very generic, then you can make up whatever you want. But if you're playing in a setting inspired by source material, then you have to make decisions as a GM how far you go. Some GMs like to take Star Wars and say, what happens if the rebels didn't blow up the Death Star at the end of episode 4? We're going to play that campaign. Other GMs might say, what if my players are Luke, Leia, Han, and Chewie? Go for it. And you guys play that campaign. These all have their own pitfalls and benefits. If you're starting from scratch, make the world yours. If you're playing in somebody else's sandbox, like Star Wars or Forgotten Realms, make that campaign yours. At the end of the day, your campaign is your campaign, no matter where it's set. Make it yours. Make decisions that affect the world in a unique way, because even when we're playing in Star Wars, even when we're playing in Forgotten Realms, if your players make decisions that ripple out beyond their sphere of influence, if they hear about these things happening elsewhere, or through the HoloNet news, or through the town crier, then your players will realize that they're living and playing in a breathing world, in a world where their decisions matter and they're actually characters in this universe. Number 8, your first session checklist. As a GM, write down all your hopes and fears and worries out on a sheet of paper or something. Also make a first session checklist, things that you definitely want to do in your first session. Now, assuming you're playing a little bit longer for your first session, at least I hope you are, otherwise it might not get off to as great of a start as you hoped. Say you sit down and you write down, I'm really worried that we have a mercenary in the group and I really think that he's only motivated by money. How can I press on that character to see if there's more there than just money? And that player might have just money as a motive early on, but it's your job and their job to make a character that's going to grow throughout the storytelling, the cooperative storytelling at the table. No character should start and end with money as their motive or their inspiration. That's not a role-playing character, that's a flat archetype that frankly, that's an NPC. You should take their character and play it for them. You probably do better at it, right? Money is money. Why are they so obsessed with money? What happened in their past that made them obsessed with money? Now I get off topic, but these are the kind of things that you should worry about, because when you're looking at your players, you're looking at your characters, think about moments that you can create for those characters. Try to build something for each and every character that will make them feel really cool in that first session. Make them feel like they have worth in the party, whether they're individuals coming together as a party or whether they're a party who's been at it for years. In the first session, if your players are unsure what to do, especially if they're in a new setting, if they've never played role-playing games before, offer them advice. Say, have you thought about trying the door? Yeah, sure, you might hear monsters behind it, but it's your job as the GM to keep the fiction moving. Put options before your players and allow them to kind of hang themselves with all the rope you give them. Players only grow by making choices, whether they be good or bad. As a GM, it's your job to provide them with those choices. And for brand new players or brand new players to a setting, sometimes they're not entirely sure what the choices are. They come in from a heavy Star Trek background and they hit Star Wars. Can I teleport? Is there such thing as shields? Is there faster than light travel? I don't really know what these things are because I have such a strong background in X and we're playing in Y. Give your players options that allow them to see the differences of your universe versus the canon universe or versus other universes. Give them options to help them make choices. And eventually, when they start making those choices, you won't need to give them the options anymore because they'll grow in confidence in their choice making. Another item for your first session checklist is to create moments to make your setting feel real. And this, say we're in a city, an urban sprawling landscape. Give them a moment that makes them feel like this is a real city and not just you at a table telling stories. Give them a homeless person that strikes a weird chord. Show them the drug addict in the alley shooting up in the darkness. Show them things that would make them realize where they're at, what's at stake, and how real this world can be. Because for your players, if they see that this is a real world, then they're going to be inspired to make real decisions. And the best role-playing I've ever seen comes from players when they're not playing their character like they're a character in a game. When your players sit down at the table and play their characters like their characters are a real person making real decisions that have repercussions, then you'll get some of your best role-playing from your players, because they're not playing a game anymore. They're playing someone else's life. They're portraying someone else's life. Those decisions matter. Lastly, start slow with the mechanics. A lot of beginner games, especially for some of these more popular RPGs, they'll have beginner games, and these beginner games are an amazing way to start out slow and steady. Start out basic with the mechanics. Teach them what initiative is. Teach them what a basic shot with the gun or a bow or a blaster looks like. Teach them what a basic melee lightsaber swing or broadsword or flail. Teach them what these mean. Give your combat flavor, but give it a foundation for them to grow off of. And before the end of this first session is even over, you'll see your players understanding the base mechanics, but only if you go slow. You know, some games, no matter how many times you sit down and play, some things are just going to be elusive for rules. I still, after years of playing Star Wars, the FFG Star Wars system, still don't have a good handle on space combat. But that doesn't mean that I shy away from it. It means we make up our own rules. Or we use the rules as a foundation and go from there. Start slow with your rules and introduce your players to them so they can build on the foundation of what they know and see what options and opportunities are available to them. In your first session checklist, it should say, start slow with rules and build on previously established foundations, but also showcase what some of the skills, what some of the characteristics can do. Showcase the amount of amazing things you can do in a role-playing game. One of my favorite selling points to my friends for role-playing games is that you can do anything you want, and we'll just figure out what the rules are for it later. If that's flying, then we look at magic. If it's going invisible, then we probably look at magic some more. But if it's creating someone and seeing what they do with their lives, pressing on human emotions, pressing on what it means to be a human, what it means to be intelligent, what it means to be loved or beloved. These are the things that role-playing games can explore, right? Sure, you can make money, you can make credits, you can make gold, but when you make a significant character moment, or you give your characters an opportunity for that significant moment, that's the kind of role-playing games that every GM should aspire to. It's providing moments for your players to grow and become stronger in their play style, in their character development. Now, final thoughts before we go. I know I've been talking for a while. Final thoughts, right? This is your game as much as it is your players. You should never run a game that you would feel uninspired to run. Sit down with your players and ask them, what systems are you guys interested in? If they don't know, then pick one that you are. If you're really interested in the system, pitch it to your players. If they're not interested, maybe try and find new players or figure out how you can make it work with them. You know, there's so many, countless role-playing games. You'd really be surprised at how many there are. I didn't even know how many there were until I started this channel 8 months ago, until I came back from Gen Con. And you really got to see that every single day, every single year, people are working on new role-playing systems. And a lot of them are crap, straight up. But some of them are amazing. And every single role-playing system you run as a GM will make you a better GM. Every single role-playing system you play in as a player will make you a better player, because you will learn and you evolve and you beg, borrow, and steal mechanics or ideas from other systems. Make this game as much for you as you do for your players, because I guarantee you're going to be working your butt off on this campaign, especially behind the scenes, stuff your players won't see. Sometimes that sucks. But at the end of the day, if it weren't for you as the GM, odds are this game wouldn't get run. So make it as much for you as you do for them. Talk to your players. Always be talking to your players about expectations, about mechanics, about their character development, where they see their character going, where they want to see the story go. Role-playing games can be you as the GM, dictator, tyrant, telling everyone how things are going to go, and you trying to win the game because the only way you win the game as a GM is to kill your party. That's one style of GMing. And then there's the complete opposite style of GMing. there's a lot of role-playing systems that I like to play where I don't even roll the dice. I don't get to kill my party. I don't have an interest in killing my party's characters. Granted, I'll do it if they're being idiots or if the fiction demands it, but ultimately, if you kill someone's character, where is the growth in that? They might grow as a player playing something new, but if you kill their player every single time you sit down and play, you're not playing a role-playing game. You're just rolling dice and making and alienating your friends. So when we're talking about talking to your players, if you accidentally made a mistake as a GM, you can own up to it. Your players are incredibly understanding if you talk to them about it. If you made one player way too powerful with a magic item, talk to them. You know, your player might be generous enough to even give the magical item back. One of the campaigns I play in is a 13th Age campaign, and I give away all my magic shit. I just give it away all the time because it's funny for me as a player. I'm one of those players who generally likes to play with one arm tied behind my back because that's where some of the most amazing moments come from. Now, you as a GM, you might see this player and you're like, oh, they're not invested in my game. But it's quite the opposite. I'm playing my character so hard that he doesn't know he's in a game. He doesn't need that ring. He doesn't need that magical ring that he got. He gives it away to his, love to be as a memento of his affection and love. Yeah, it costs him majorly when it comes to combat. But your player might not regret that. And that's a beautiful thing. Now, you as a GM talking to your player, right, he got this magical broadsword that's way too powerful. Well, you've got a couple options. You can give everybody else magical weapons that'll overpower them too, but then your combat is going to fall flat because everybody just racks whatever you throw at them. Talk to your player. If they're unwilling to work with you and give up that magical weapon, then create a downside for that weapon. Create a drawback that balances it out. This game is all about having fun, ultimately, right? And when one player kills every monster ahead of you, how are your other players having any fun? Sure, they might be a cheerleader for that person, but after the 4th or 5th combat, it kind of gets old. Nobody wants to watch other people be the most amazing person at the game for more than they can stand not to be that amazing person once in a while. Talk to your players, communicate with them always, and they will help you build the best role-playing game together. Lastly, I promise this is done. Have fun. Fun is the most important rule that you as a GM and you as a table can put as your number one rule. Mechanics will help you tell the story, but if you guys aren't having fun, you're not going to be inspired to come back every single week or every single month, sit down for a couple hours or half a day and play role-playing games. Role-playing games aren't about winning. They're about creating amazing memories with you and your friends that you'll cherish for the rest of your life. At least, that's what we do here at my table. Your results may vary. Anyways, thank you very much for joining me. I know this video is a bit long. I plan on doing more GM talks in the future, breaking down different categories, talking about a plethora of experiences that I've had in my decade plus of role-playing games. If you have any situations, you as a GM or you as a player who's interested in GMing, and you're worried about or want to fine-tune or kind of tighten up or talk with me about, let me know in the comments below, and I would be more than happy to make a video in the future discussing those topics with you and the rest of the audience here at Nerds and Stuff. If you have any questions, please leave them below. I look forward to talking with you guys again soon. Until next time, tell a story, share an adventure.